Thank you, Veronique. Yes, so my name's Jenny Molloy. I'm based at the University of Cambridge as a Shuttleworth Foundation Research Fellow, and I'm fortunate enough to be sponsored by a foundation that really funds fellows to explore the intersection between open source, technology and education, so very related to our topics this evening. And my particular take on that, so I'm a molecular biologist by training. My PhD was in genetic control of mosquito populations. And one of the things that I really felt around open science is that some of the amazing work that's being done in access and data and some of the models and frameworks that are being built around that kind of break down when you get to tools in the physical world. And tools in the physical world are really important for science as well, particularly the biological and life sciences, where we make extensive use of hardware and also biological DNA cell lines, all these model organisms that kind of dominate work, I'm sure, at the Crick and in other institutions. And so to look at how openness plays out in that realm as well as in the digital world. So I'm the first speaker, so I felt I sort of should lay a little bit of the ground on what open is, but I'm pretty sure each and every speaker that comes up will give their own perspective. And so what does open mean? Well, to me, and I have stolen this slide with attribution from Cameron Naylan, because I really liked it. It's really sharing what we already create. As scientists particularly, we're already creating data sets, we're already creating knowledge, and open science really encourages us to share that in ways that make it more useful to other people. And you can take a sort of narrow view on what open means, and that is useful in many contexts. And so some of you are probably familiar with the open definition, which talks about a piece of data or content being open if anyone is free to use, reuse and redistribute it, subject only at most to the requirement to attribute and or share alike. And this is the type of openness that typically characterizes the open access and open data work. If you have done some research and you have some knowledge, what are the permissions that you give other people to use that knowledge? But progressively, we're seeing more around open science as a kind of means of actually producing knowledge. And I know some of the talks tonight will also touch on that, WENS particularly. And so I quite like this definition of openness from Open ICT for D, ICT for Development, which talks about some of these open approaches that provide mechanisms for organizing our knowledge production. So not just how we share what we already produce, but making the way we produce it more open. And it talks about universal versus restricted access, which is really related to the definition I just gave. Universal versus restricted participation in the production of knowledge, and also collaborative versus centralized production. And I think that was really well characterized by the description of what the Crick are trying to do in some of their programs. And so how does some of this map onto technology, particularly in the life sciences? I'm going to try and give 3 examples of initiatives that I've been involved with. And I'm going to use them to try and explore 3 myths around open source technologies once you move outside of the software space, where I think a lot of this is quite established in terms of open source software is recognized as a phenomenon that has made money and has made massive impacts in the commercial space. Other areas of open technologies are really lagging behind in terms of recognition. And I think that a lot of the kind of reasons why open source software has achieved the impact it has, again, kind of fall down when you're talking about hardware, research tools, biology, because it's not zero cost of reproduction. It's not instantly transmittable through the internet. And so I'm kind of interested in where the economics and the social and legal implications of that lead us, and in what contexts making those types of things open can really make an impact in the world. And sometimes maybe making stuff open is not the best way to go. And I think as researchers, we need to be very context aware when we talk about openness. But I'd say 3 kind of things that you will find if you talk to people about open approaches and open source outside of the software and digital space, but even sometimes within. 3 myths are that open is non-commercial, always means non-commercial, not for profit. A second myth is that open almost automatically makes things more equitable and more equally distributed. And the third thing is that openness is kind of naive and it's an ideology and it's never going to make money. And so those are the three things that I hope I'm going to provide some counterexamples to, or if not counterexamples, at least some initiatives that are trying to explore around the edges of those problems. And so first of all, I would say that open does not equal non-commercial, and I know Tim and Wen are going to come back to this topic, so I'm going to give an example of the types of tools that are being produced through an initiative called Open Plant, which is a synthetic biology centre based at the University of Cambridge and also the John Innes Centre and Earlham Institute in Norwich. And so Open Plant are developing the next generation of plant synthetic biology tools and technologies. And part of the motivation for this is really to try and open up innovation, not only in academia, but also in a commercial sense and also in a more global sense than is currently possible, particularly in the agriculture space, but also in terms of making medicines in plants, making useful high-value chemicals in plants. Open Plant is a consortium of 20 labs and also many, many external partners and groups that work with us. And so the structure of this entire consortium, which I think it's probably true to say is one of the bigger funded consortia that the research councils have funded that very explicitly has open in the title. This is a £12 million centre over 5 years. It's really structured along the lines of having a two-tier approach to intellectual property. And so the directors of the centre, Professor Jim Hasloff in Cambridge and Professor Anne Osborne at the John Innes Centre, and our senior PIs, David Balcombe and Dale over at the John Innes Centre, have kind of come up with this as a model for how you might structure work that spans from the basic research, largely that's concentrated at the University of Cambridge, through to some really cutting-edge applied work going on at the John Innes Centre and also at the Earlham Institute. And so this kind of model looks at what areas of science, particularly in terms of tool development, are most valuable to make open. And so this is essentially the tools and resources on which innovation will be built. And so the idea is that there are going to be shared libraries of these foundational tools and enabling technologies, that things like standards for DNA parts, for constructing useful tools for editing plant genomes, and also the model organisms. So the consortium is trying to establish Marcantia, which is a simple liverwort, as a plant chassis for synthetic biology. So all of these things are intended to be publicly shared and in the public domain as far as is reasonably practicable. And in some cases, that's involved actually creating new legal tools to enable us to do that, and I'll come back to that in a second. But then, you know, you need investment to take these innovations forward. And one of the tricky and thorny questions, which again, I'm pretty sure Wen will come up with in his presentation, is where's that barrier? Where is the best place to put the barrier between the public domain of open sharing and the protected domain where you can attract investment and have a reasonable expectation of getting funding back through having, you know, a limited monopoly? And again, because of just the cost structure of doing biotechnology, that looks quite different from doing some of the more digital technologies, particularly in terms of capital investment and around, you know, regulation and the time that it takes to take a product to market. So there are clearly contexts in which intellectual property has a very helpful role to play in getting stuff out there. The question is, are we always applying it when it's not necessarily the best thing to reach the end goal? And so that's the structure. Part of the motivation was really that, particularly in plant biotechnology, it's really dominated by very large companies that hold a lot of intellectual property and a lot of foundational technology patents for gene editing, including ownership of seed stocks as well. And those are undergoing even more consolidation and mergers. And so the concern around this is, you know, where do you see the smaller players being able to enter the market? Where do you see the globalization and people being able to come up with innovation outside of very well-resourced companies in North America and Europe? So that's a big question and probably needs some economists on board to answer. But when you set out trying to make stuff open, you quickly realize that as much as you really want to answer the big questions, there are a lot of small challenges along the way in actually practically making things work. And so I know that there are many stories from the digital space in terms of standardization and licensing and how you make all that work together. The same is actually true in biology as well. So some of you who have worked in biology labs may be familiar with the concept of a material transfer agreement. This is a contract which is typically signed between institutions. When you send a tube of DNA to your colleague at another university, usually the institutions will have signed off on a material transfer agreement. And the standard one at the moment, which was a step forward, so there didn't used to be a standard agreement, and it demonstrably held back the speed of the science being done. The standardized agreement is helpful in terms of people signing off on it quickly, but it also it's very restrictive. And so all of those permissions that we looked at earlier in terms of the open definition, the standard MTAs specifically say you cannot redistribute this. You can't even send it to your mate in the lab down the hallway. You cannot do anything commercial with this, and really just kind of reduce the access. Now, if you want to make your material open, as Open Plant does, that is a problem. And so we came up with, in collaboration with Linda Kale, who's a lawyer and also was previously a biologist and very engaged with the open biotechnology space, and the Bioeconomy Foundation in the US, we came up with the Open Material Transfer Agreement, which is a really simple, standardized legal tool to enable you to share biological materials. Now, the interesting thing about this is that, in fact, some of these materials are already what you would describe as open. So there are no patents on these materials. There is no IP, if you like, on these materials, but they're still being exchanged under restrictive contracts and MTAs. And so this is just to illustrate that sometimes things can be closed down in ways that you might not be very familiar with. So in fact, the Bioeconomy Foundation has an entire collection of DNA that is specifically off patent, but they deposit in various repositories, including AdGene, which is a big non-profit repository, and most of those repositories, in fact, almost all of them distribute under material transfer agreements that say, actually, you received the physical material from us, and now you can't redistribute it because you signed the contract, even though, in fact, there's no intellectual property. So that's just an illustration of some of the barriers. I'll move on to the next myth now, which is that, we just make it open, and then everyone can get it. It's accessible, it's equitable sharing of knowledge. I mean, that isn't really true in the digital space. I'm sure you're familiar that there are many researchers around the world who don't have the same level of broadband that we do here at the Crick and in the UK more generally. And also language is a major barrier for accessing digital information. But it becomes even more acute when you're talking about physically shipping materials and tools to people. And so one of the initiatives that I've been involved with for 3 years now is the Gathering for Open Science Hardware. And so this is a community of researchers who build, use, and otherwise are involved in creating an ecosystem around scientific instruments and equipment which are openly licensed and often able to be reproduced at low cost, although low cost is only one of the aspects. Some of the instruments are open source, but by no means low cost. And so for some examples, this is a 3D printed micro manipulator. The design files are freely available on the web. You can print your own if you happen to have a printer yourself. Open Drop is a digital microfluidics platform. And that's, at the end, is a Backyard Brains educational device. It's an electromyograph for measuring muscle electrical signals. And so all of these are published under open licenses. And actually, all of them are sold. And there are now many, many, many companies, definitely in the order of dozens, selling open source instrumentation to researchers. And there are some good examples of those actually receiving VC investment and other investment as well, and really operating as a normal company. So this is an example of what we did last year, which was come up with a roadmap to guide the community. And so this is just going back to the idea of kind of open participation in driving forward open science around research tools specifically. And this led to the Open Science Hardware Roadmap, which you can read online if you like. But it basically just lays out a roadmap for where the community thinks we should go in terms of supporting these types of initiatives, including creating institutional and funding support structures and preparing guidelines. Also, things around supporting the community to do the best that they can do and have mentorship programs and networks. And so I guess this is just an example of kind of one of the aspects of being part of an open science community, an open research community, is building the community. We think we've done a reasonably good job. We are meeting next week in Shenzhen. I'm actually flying on Friday to China, which is our third meeting of the Gathering for Open Science Hardware. And we just really see that this kind of cross-fertilization can help, and particularly over 50% of our attendees are from countries in the global south and are doing their research in very resource-limited conditions. And so they really see a benefit in designing context-specific protocols, context-specific hardware. And so I think one of the things that openness does is it does allow these communities to come around together, have a design, share designs, modify them to people's own contexts, share those back out again. And we're seeing a lot of collaborations between people in different countries and different disciplines, and really kind of, in some cases, reclaiming hardware for themselves and saying, actually, I'm going to design my hardware to suit my experiment, not design my experiment around the hardware that I can get off the shelf. And so we really try and emphasize that it's not just about stuff being cheap, it's about doing the best science that you can do in the context that you're in. Okay, so I'll move on to my final point because I only have a few minutes remaining of my time. In fact, 5 minutes. Thank you, Frank. So the other thing is, well, yes, that openness, it's never going to work. You're never going to get any money. That's a really ideologically driven, naive idea. And so what I'm trying to kind of make the argument for is that openness can be a strategic choice. And I've now been involved in academic initiatives that work in the open, produce open things for several years. And this is a constant feedback point that we get is, well, how are you going to work with industry? How are you going to ever make any money? How are you going to translate that research? This is it's all very well playing around in your sandpit, but this is not going to make large-scale, real-world impact. And so I'm not going to speak about either the Structural Genomics Consortium or the Neuro, because I know Wen is going to cover those. But just to say that the drug discovery space is a really interesting one to explore these concepts in. And so definitely, if you're not familiar with either of these initiatives, look them up because they're doing some fantastic work and really digging down into, can you take, where is that barrier? The diagram I showed before, the public domain and the intellectual property protected domain, how can you shift that and what effect does it have on accelerating research, on reducing redundancy, on de-risking some of the innovation process? And they're doing that and they're evaluating it, which is really nice. I mean, particularly the Neuro, I was lucky enough to be involved in a workshop at the Wellcome Trust earlier this year, which was looking at, how do you evaluate the impact of being open? So the Neuro have taken, this is a neurological institute based in Montreal. They have a 5-year open science pledge, essentially, policy. They're not going to patent anything that comes out of the institute for 5 years, which is an amazing experiment. And we need to experiment. I think that's what I kind of tell people when they say, oh, well, it's naive. Well, okay, let's test it. We're all scientists. Let's actually have some initiatives that put stuff out there openly and really see how far we can track it. And so I mean, I always describe the SGC's kind of success in getting buy-in from large pharmaceutical companies, of which they have many on board, who pay many millions of pounds. Wen would know better than me probably the overall funding for the SGC, but we've got to be getting on for over $500 million. I mean, it's probably more, yeah. And those companies see the benefit because, they're throwing away a lot of money in doing the same research. And the efficiency savings and the lowering of risk, if you're in a really risky enterprise where 99% of your targets are not going to work, actually sharing knowledge at that early stage has a lot of benefits. And so I think it's just being a bit more nuanced about where we see the benefits of openness and in what context it really drives forward innovation and, in some cases, commerce, which is the other topic for this evening. Other examples, Tesla have pledged all of their patents for their electric car technology. I don't know if many of you remember that headline from a few years back. And again, this is not a naive or probably very altruistic move. Tesla are reliant on a lot of infrastructure. It's better for Tesla if more people are driving electric cars. That means that the government and other funders are forced to put money into having more electric charging points, which means more Tesla cars being bought. And so, particularly where we're talking about industries that rely on large-scale infrastructure and are trying to make a massive change, and we're seeing a lot of this now. Electric cars are just one example of these transitions to sustainability that are being pushed by public policy, also pushed by technology. And I think that that's a really interesting area for where openness can make a big difference. Another example of a company that is making money and is open is Arduino. Many of you may be familiar with these little microprocessors, very popular with the maker movement and kind of the new sort of expansion of coding teaching in our schools. I'm good, I'm going to do this in 1 minute for sure. Arduino's turnover last year was $13 million. They're not doing badly, and they've shipped millions of units. Okay, so how does this map onto the bioeconomy, which is kind of the title of my talk? Well, a lot of countries do have bioeconomy strategies. Other than this is the idea that we are moving towards a world in which we make more stuff using biology, which is typically seen as being much more environmentally friendly than the way we do it right now in terms of chemical synthesis, polluting industries. It's not always true, but in many cases it is. And so this is how can we use biomass to produce useful things. Apart from the US, none of these bioeconomy strategies really mention this idea of openness as a strategy or kind of transitions to sustainability. If anything, many of them do focus on patents and intellectual property, and yet many of them are trying to address things like the Sustainable Development Goals. And really, all of these things that biology can contribute to perhaps need a different framework than the typical innovation framework that's coming up in many of the policies that are being published. And so my kind of thesis for a lot of my research is that I think the policy narratives on the idea of openness in a bioeconomy, they need to be informed by the practical, legal, social, and economic realities of biological research. And that's sort of, having come from the biological space, I'm now moving into the social sciences. And particularly, I'm interested in how we can build a sustainable bioeconomy using open research tools. So there are a lot of technologies out there. Institutions like SGC, like OpenPlant, are making these open tools available. There is a whole lot of stuff coming off patent. As Linda, our lawyer friend who made the Open MTA, likes to say, patents are a great way of making technology open, because after 20 years, that information is in the public domain and it is available for you. They don't last forever. But many people don't know that stuff is going off patent, and so highlighting that and really then working on how do we make it equitable and accessible. I'm not interested in a piece of DNA in a database being open. I want it on a researcher's lab bench. What is stopping that happening? And so often, even if it's open in theory, it's still not landing where it needs to land to make an impact. And so how do we fix the disrupted supply chain? So that's what I'm focusing on. I don't have answers. Invite me back in a few years and hopefully I'll have some more things to say. But I just want to say, if you are interested in the kind of this contextual work around open and how it fits into the economy, particularly, I am a convener of a seminar series at Cambridge, which will be live streamed and you can join remotely. If you check the CRASH website, Centre for Research in Art, Social Sciences and Humanities, we have 12 seminars over the coming academic year, all around open IP models for emerging technologies and implications for an equitable society. And so this term we're thinking about rethinking economics and open intellectual property. Next term we're looking around the kind of values and motivations of people working in open technologies, including a kind of open science, open research area. And you're very welcome. And that's just thank you to all my funders and collaborators. There's many of them. The license slide, if you can read it, for all the images that I used. Yeah, thank you very much for listening. And I will share the slides online, so you can look at them later.
Any questions, reactions?
So putting to related, so So I have two interrelated questions.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, is there any data on how we're moving over time, whereas in terms of how much of what percentage of research in biomedical science is now being covered by patent over, say, 20 years ago or 30 years ago? And of course, the second part of the question is, has the surge in biotechnology and sort of the trend to translate more and more by basic research been pushing for more patents over new discoveries or more openness? I mean, do you have any idea on?
So in the patent space, for sure, over the last 20 to 30 years, there's been an increase in patenting. And particularly in the 80s, there was an act passed in the US, which led to quite a quick upsurge in patenting. So yeah, I mean, I don't have exact figures, but the line is on the up in terms of numbers of patents for that kind of institutions are filing on research. And there are many incentives for them to do that, including, of course, metrics that, and this is the interesting thing about the Wellcome Trust event, looking at how do you take the neuro and assess its impact over time. Well, a lot of the times when you're looking for the innovative output of an institution or a country, you're looking at patent data. And so if you're specifically saying, well, we're not going to patent, I mean, how do you track that? So yeah, there is an increase. For many reasons, but partly as a result of public policy has led to part of that increase. And I think also the fact that there's no kind of counter-narrative. There's no prevailing counter-narrative on the patent side, really, at the moment, to not do that. And so the trend tends to be to just do it. That's not true of all institutions. Some institutions are quite picky about what they patent. Some are a bit more kind of laissez-faire about putting everything and protecting it. In terms of the second question, with basic research and kind of the push for translation, I think probably that has had a role to play in terms of that you are kind of, you have to demonstrate often when you're applying for public funding that you have a path to commercialization and translation. I'm not really old enough, to be honest, to know how the text of those has changed over time. Maybe someone else can sort of speak to that a little bit. But certainly I do hear feedback from researchers now who write in the impact and commercialization section, I'm going to make it open because that is the way to achieve what I want to achieve and achieve the greatest impact and the greatest reach. And they sometimes get pushback from reviewers saying, well, what is this? Please kind of fill it in properly and write your commercialization plan. Whereas it feels like I'm going to patent it and then start a spin-off company and sell it is kind of unquestioned. And so what I'm kind of keen to see is a little bit more of questioning that and just saying, actually, what do you want to achieve? Is this the best way to achieve it? And I'm very pleased that Wellcome, on their Open Research Fund, actually had a question of how do you want to achieve the greatest impact for your research? I'm paraphrasing, but it was basically that. And you had a choice of two options. You could either protect the intellectual property and commercialize it that way, or you can make it as openly accessible to people as you wanted. And I think I want to see more of that from funders, because I think if the default setting tends to, and once you've been taught how to write a grant proposal and fill it in, that kind of gets copied and pasted. So I'm hoping that over time it will become more of a conversation. I think right now it's not a conversation that's being had.
It's also about education. Is how do you educate researchers to think about it, and how do you give them tools to be able to put it? So we have a big role to play in educating people.
Absolutely, and right now, to be honest, we just don't have the positive case studies that it would be great to have to show that you can do that. And I'm a lot riding on some of these initiatives to do a good job and show that it can be done, because I think without that kind of evidence, it's very difficult to make the case for more experiments, and which is what we need to show if it actually works and in what context.
One more question? From the audience? Come on. Oh,
It's one over there.
I was kind of interested in the idea that in many cases you have two layers and you're looking for different models of funding. A lot of the things that can make a big difference in the hardware and software sort of areas are almost looking to be sustainable to start with.
Yeah.
So is that a different model where what you'd be saying is we need support to be sustainable, and this is the potential that we have to make a difference, but sustainable is the first step where you cease to need support, and then you can kind of go on to explore other things afterwards?
Absolutely, and the pattern is very much with a lot of the open science hardware companies, because many of them are researchers who basically solved one of their own problems. It's kind of it is similar in some cases to the patterns you see in people setting up companies around open data and open science kind of tools that help you do that. So they've solved a problem themselves, and now they want to scale it up and get it out to other researchers. And they definitely start with a kind of, I just want to make this sustainable. Like, I just want to be, many of them are kind of incubated within institutions for a while, and then they just want that one person who's going to actually deal with the marketing and deal with the business side. And then they sort of aim to grow very slowly. And I think that's one of the challenges, is that a lot of these companies, they're not VC hockey stick exponential growth companies. They're doing useful stuff, and they have capacity to gain revenue, but in a rather more sustainable, linear kind of way. And so funding is an issue for them, for sure. And many are kind of born of publicly funded research projects. And then sort of, wonder how we're going to do it. Some of them have done very well based on revenue and just sort of starting small and building up. Others have gone in for the venture capital side. There's fewer of those. But I think it's a big question, and it comes up in the digital space as well. How do you support these tools, particularly the more and more they start becoming increasingly part of the infrastructure that we just expect to see? How do you assure that sustainability? And what's the mix of public and private funding that will kind of get you to where you want to be? Yeah, it's a big question.